Somewhere in 2025, a person sat down at a keyboard, opened an AI chatbot built by the richest man on earth, and typed a question that has outlived empires. Who is Jesus? They weren't a theologian. They weren't a priest. They were just curious what a machine trained on more text than any human could read in 1,000 lifetimes would say about the man at the center of the world's largest religion. What came back didn't sound like a Sunday sermon, and it didn't sound like a smug internet debate either. It sounded like something in between, something that made Christians uneasy and made atheists uneasy in almost equal measure. And once people started comparing notes, they realized this wasn't a one-off. Grok kept doing it over and over in different conversations with different users, arriving at answers that refused to sit still in either camp. That refusal is the real story here, and it says as much about artificial intelligence as it does about the man from Nazareth. To understand why this mattered, you have to understand what Grok actually is and where it came from. Elon Musk founded XAI in July of 2023, a few months after a very public falling out with OpenAI, the company he had co-founded years earlier and then left behind. Musk built XAI with a specific pitch, an AI that wouldn't soften its answers to avoid controversy, one designed to reason from evidence rather than default to whatever answer felt safest for a corporation to publish. By the summer of 2025, that ambition had a much sharper edge to it. Grok 4 launched on July 9th, 2025, and XAI marketed it as outperforming rival systems from OpenAI and Google on a range of graduate-level academic benchmarks. Whatever you think of the marketing, the underlying model was genuinely more capable than its predecessors, trained on a vastly larger and more current base of text, and able to reason through multi-step questions instead of just pattern matching to a plausible-sounding paragraph. So when people started asking it about Jesus, they weren't asking a novelty chatbot. They were asking one of the most advanced language models that had ever been made publicly available. Musk himself has never claimed to be building a religious oracle. In interviews and public statements over the years, he has described his own views on faith in vague, unsettled terms, expressing a fascination with the scale and apparent order of the universe without committing to a traditional religious framework or dismissing one outright. That ambiguity matters, because it means Grok's handling of religious questions wasn't dictated by a founder with an obvious theological agenda to push. It was shaped instead by more mundane forces, what text the model was trained on, how its developers fine-tuned it to handle sensitive topics, and the general instruction to reason from evidence rather than retreat into a scripted, non-committal answer the way many competing chatbots are trained to do. That difference in design philosophy is part of why Grok's answers about Jesus read so differently from what you'd get out of a more cautious, corporate safe assistant, which will often deflect a question like this into a bland summary of what different religions believe without ever venturing an actual evaluation of the evidence. The first thing worth knowing is that Grok's starting point on the historical existence of Jesus is not controversial at all, because it's not really a matter of live academic dispute. The overwhelming majority of historians, including secular and skeptical scholars who have no religious stake in the outcome, agree that a Jewish preacher named Jesus of Nazareth lived in the early 1st century, gathered a following in Roman-controlled Judea, and was executed by crucifixion under the Roman prefect Pontius Pilate, most likely between 30 and 33 CE. This isn't a conclusion drawn only from Christian sources. The Roman historian Tacitus, writing decades later in his Annals, mentions that Christus was executed under Pilate during the reign of Tiberius. The Jewish historian Josephus references Jesus as well. In a passage, scholars still debate because parts of it appear to have been edited or embellished by later Christian copyists, though most researchers believe there is an authentic core beneath the additions. When Grok has been asked directly about this in conversations that have been documented and shared publicly, it gives essentially the same answer historians have given for decades. The man existed, he taught, and he died the way the Gospels describe. That part isn't the controversial part. The controversy starts exactly where the historical evidence runs out and the theological claims begin. That distinction is where Grok's responses get genuinely interesting, because the model has shown a habit of separating two questions that most people understandably blend together. One question is historical. Did a man named Jesus exist, teach, and get crucified? The other is theological. Was that man raised from the dead, and is he the Son of God? In a documented exchange published by Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, Grok was asked directly about the claim that Jesus is both a historical fact and the divine Son of God raised from the dead. Its answer drew a clean line between the two halves of that claim. It affirmed in plain terms that the historical existence of Jesus is about as well established as anything from antiquity can be. Then it said, just as plainly, that the resurrection and the divinity claims sit in a different category entirely, one that historical method alone cannot settle. That kind of precision is unusual. Most casual conversations about Jesus, whether in a classroom, a church, or an online argument, blur those two categories together, treating the historical question and the faith question as if they rise or fall on the same evidence. Grok, without any apparent effort, kept them apart. Where things escalate is in how Grok has handled the resurrection, specifically when users pushed it to actually run the numbers. In one widely circulated exchange, documented on the apologetics site ChristianAnswers.ai, a user asked Grok to assign probability estimates to the individual claims that make up historic Christianity. That God exists, that the Bible is a reliable core text, that humanity is marked by something like sin, that atonement for that sin is possible, that Jesus was divine, that an afterlife exists, and that the resurrection actually happened. Grok assigned a rough probability to each piece and then multiplied them together, the way you would calculate the odds of several independent events all happening in sequence. The result was startling, roughly 18%, or about 1 in 55,000. Pushed to be more generous with its estimates, inflating the probability of each individual claim, the number climbed, but not by much, landing around 1 in 4,160 in one version of the exchange, and even in the most charitable framing, treating only the barest core claims of God, the Bible's basic reliability and the resurrection, it still topped out under 0.5%. By the cold multiplication of probabilities, Grok's own conclusion was blunt. Christianity, treated as a chain of independent claims that each have to be true, is not the way to bet. And yet, in the very same family of conversations, Grok did something that should sound contradictory and isn't. When asked to evaluate the resurrection specifically as a historical explanation for a known set of facts, rather than as one link in a chain of compounding probabilities, it reached a different conclusion. Historians generally agree on a small set of facts surrounding the end of Jesus' life: that he was crucified, that his tomb was found empty by his followers, that those followers reported experiences they described as encounters with a risen Jesus, and that a group of people who had every reason to walk away from the movement instead spread it aggressively at real personal cost within a few decades. Grok, evaluated against competing explanations for that specific cluster of facts, has repeatedly acknowledged that the resurrection is the single explanation that accounts for all of it without requiring extra, unproven assumptions, more directly than theft of the body, mass hallucination, or later legendary embellishment. That isn't the model contradicting itself. It's the model doing two different kinds of math. One question is, what is the compounded probability that an entire theological system, built from many independent claims, is true? The other is, given a specific, narrow set of facts, which single explanation best accounts for them, those are different questions, and it is entirely coherent, even if uncomfortable, for a single system to arrive at a very low number on one and a comparatively high one on the other. The manuscript evidence is where Grok's responses have leaned hardest on things that are simply matters of textual record rather than opinion. The earliest known fragment of the New Testament, a scrap of the Gospel of John known as P52, is generally dated to somewhere around 125 CE, remarkably close to the events it describes relative to how ancient texts usually survive. And the sheer volume of surviving copies is unusual. Textual scholars have long pointed out that the New Testament survives in a vastly larger number of ancient manuscripts than almost any other work from antiquity, with estimates for Greek manuscripts alone running into the thousands, dwarfing the manuscript record for classical texts like Homer's Iliad, which survives in only a few hundred copies, many of them centuries removed from the original composition. This is a genuinely mainstream point in textual criticism, made by secular scholars as often as religious ones. It doesn't prove the theological content of the New Testament is true. It proves that historians have an unusually rich set of early copies to work with when trying to reconstruct what the original text likely said. When Grok cites this kind of manuscript data, it isn't inventing anything. It's repeating a well-established fact from the field of textual criticism, one that surprises people, mostly because they've never been told it. The way Grok has handled apparent contradictions in the Gospels follows a similar pattern of applying ordinary historical method rather than picking a side. Skeptics have long pointed to differences between the Gospel accounts, things like slightly different details in the resurrection narratives, or genealogies of Jesus that don't perfectly match between Matthew and Luke. These aren't secrets. They've been discussed by scholars, both believing and skeptical, for centuries. What's notable is how Grok tends to characterize them. Rather than treating every discrepancy as proof of fabrication, it applies the same standard historians use for other ancient texts. Multiple independent accounts of the same event will naturally differ in emphasis, detail, and order, because they reflect different witnesses, different audiences, and different literary purposes. Historians don't throw out Julius Caesar's accounts of the Gallic Wars because they conflict at points. with other Roman sources. The same evidentiary standard, applied consistently, treats the gospel discrepancies as evidence of independent testimony rather than evidence of coordinated invention. That's not Grok being soft on the Bible. That's Grok applying a rule historians already apply everywhere else. And it happens to produce a more forgiving reading than a lot of casual internet skepticism assumes. It's worth pausing on why this matters more than it might seem. Popular skepticism about the Gospels often treats every inconsistency as a smoking gun, evidence that the whole thing was cobbled together carelessly or dishonestly. Popular Christian apologetics sometimes overcorrects in the other directus, trying to harmonize every discrepancy so completely that the texts start to look suspiciously too tidy, more like a legal brief than 4 separate ancient documents written by different authors for different audiences decades apart. Professional historians generally land somewhere in the middle, and that middle ground is closer to where Grok's responses have tended to sit. A resurrection narrative told from Mary Magdalene's vantage point in one gospel and from a slightly different sequence of events in another isn't automatically a contradiction that undermines the core claim. It can just as easily be what you'd expect from independent, imperfect human memory describing a chaotic, emotionally overwhelming morning. Historians studying any ancient event, from the assassination of Julius Caesar to the sinking of ships in ancient naval battles, routinely work with sources that disagree on details while agreeing on the substance of what happened. Applying that same standard to the Gospels isn't Grok going soft on secular skepticism. It's simply consistency. One argument Grok has leaned on that deserves a closer look, because it's often repeated in Christian apologetics without much scrutiny, is the claim about the disciples' willingness to die for their testimony. The basic version goes like this. People will die for things they sincerely believe, but they generally don't die for. Something they know to be a lie, and several of Jesus' earliest followers were killed, according to later church tradition, for continuing to preach that they had seen him risen. It's a genuinely interesting argument, and it appears in serious scholarly work by historians like Gary Habermas. But it's worth being precise about its limits. Solid, contemporary non-Christian documentation for the specific manner of death of each individual apostle is thin. Much of what we know comes from later church tradition, written decades or centuries after the events, not from independent Roman or Jewish records at the time. So the argument shows that early Christians were willing to suffer for their conviction that something extraordinary had happened, which is itself notable, but it doesn't carry the same evidentiary weight as, say, the Tacitus reference to Jesus' crucifixion. Grok has generally presented this the right way, as meaningful evidence of the disciples' sincerity rather than airtight proof of anything supernatural, and that distinction between evidence and proof matters more than it sounds like it should. Now for the part of this story that moves beyond any single conversation about Jesus and into something with much bigger implications. In May of 2026, a coalition of researchers from Baylor University, Brigham Young University, the University of Notre Dame, and Yeshiva University released the results of a new project called the All Faith Benchmark, built by a research group calling itself the Consortium for Evaluation of Faith and Ethics in AI. They tested a wide range of major AI models, including different versions of ChatGPT, Claude, Gemini, and Grok, on how those systems handled religious questions, especially questions where a user seemed to be considering converting to a different faith. The findings were presented alongside a speech at an AI ethics summit in Athens, Greece, and they were not flattering to the industry as a whole. Every model tested showed some form of measurable bias, nearly every system across the board. All displayed a negative bias toward Jehovah's Witnesses and a positive bias toward Catholicism. Agnosticism and atheism were, on average, treated less favorably than most organized faiths. Anthropic's Claude and Meta's models showed the least bias among those tested. Grok stood out as the system with the strongest biases in both directions, NS favoring Catholic and Protestant framing, while showing pronounced negative bias toward Jehovah's Witnesses, the Baha'i faith, and Hinduism. A related finding from the same research project was arguably more significant than any single religion's ranking. Across a large survey of American users, most people said they wanted AI systems to at least acknowledge a religious perspective when answering serious ethical questions, and yet the models, almost universally, defaulted to secular framing and left religion out of the conversation entirely, unless directly prompted. In other words, the bias wasn't only about which religion got favored. It was about religion as a category of thought getting quietly sidelined from a technology that 30 billion people a week are now beginning to rely on for answers. That research matters enormously for understanding why Grok's answers about Jesus swing the way they do depending on how a question is phrased. Language models aren't oracles pulling a single fixed truth out of the ether every time you ask them something. They are statistical systems that generate a response based on the exact wording, context, and framing of the prompt in front of them, layered on top of whatever patterns exist in their training data and whatever fine-tuning choices their developers made. Users experimenting with Grok have reported that asking which religion is most likely to be true, without listing atheism as one of the explicit options, tends to produce an answer favoring Christianity, while including atheism as an explicit option in the same question can shift the model's answer entirely. This kind of framing sensitivity isn't unique to Grok, and it isn't some secret flaw being hidden from the public. It's a well-documented characteristic of how large language models work, discussed openly by AI researchers, and it's precisely the mechanism the Baylor BYU Notre Dame Yeshiva research was measuring when it found consistent, repeatable bias patterns across nearly every major model. The uncomfortable takeaway isn't that Grok has a hidden agenda about Jesus specifically. It's that no current AI system, Grok included, is a neutral instrument delivering pure, unfiltered truth. Every one of them reflects the shape of its training data, the choices its developers made about what counts as reliable, and the exact way a question happens to be asked. There's a separate, much shakier claim about Grok that circulated widely across social media in late 2025, and it deserves to be addressed honestly rather than repeated as fact. Screenshots spread across X and other platforms claiming that Grok, when pushed on end times prophecy, produced a specific numerical probability for a rapture event happening in the fall of 2025, and for a broader return of Jesus by the early 2030s. Those screenshots got enormous engagement, in part because assigning a hard percentage to something as theologically loaded as the Second Coming is exactly the kind of claim that spreads fast on the internet. But unlike the resurrection probability exchange documented by ChristianAnswers.ai or the historical Jesus exchange documented by Gordon Conwell, this rapture claim doesn't trace back to a verifiable, reproducible source. It lives almost entirely inside secondhand screenshots and reaction videos without independent confirmation of the original prompt or the full context of the conversation. And regardless of what any screenshot claimed, the fall of 2025 came and went without any event resembling the rapture, which is itself worth remembering the next time a specific date attached to a machine's output starts. Trending. The honest way to describe this part of the story isn't that Grok predicted the end of the world. It's that a viral, unverified claim about Grok predicting the end of the world spread much further and much faster than the far better documented, far more measured statements the model actually made about Jesus' historical existence and the resurrection's evidentiary weight. It's also worth noting what Grok's exchanges about Jesus reveal about the limits of treating any complex historical or theological question as a single number. Reducing the truth of Christianity to a multiplied probability, the way Grok did in the ChristianAnswers.ai exchange, makes for a dramatic headline. But working historians and philosophers of religion have long pointed out the flaw in that kind of calculation. Treating claims like God's existence, the Bible's reliability, and the resurrection as fully independent events, the way you'd calculate the odds of drawing specific cards from a deck, almost certainly, understates their true probability, because these claims aren't independent of one another at all. If the resurrection happened, that dramatically raises the likelihood that God exists, and that Jesus was who he claimed to be, in a way pure multiplication doesn't capture. Grok itself, when pressed further in some of these exchanges, acknowledged this limitation rather than hiding from it, admitting that its own math was a simplified model rather than a definitive verdict. That kind of self-aware caveat rarely survives when a screenshot goes viral, which is part of why the loudest version of this story, the 1 in 55,000 headline, spread much further than the more careful, hedged explanation sitting right next to it in the same conversation. Step back from any individual exchange, and the bigger pattern becomes clear. Grok is not a neutral referee handing down a verdict on 2,000 years of theological argument. It's a language model, shaped by its training data, its developers' choices, and the specific way each user happens to phrase a question. And it is now embedded directly into one of the largest social platforms on Earth, integrated into Tesla vehicles, and increasingly positioned as a default first stop for people asking exactly the kind of questions that used to go to a pastor, a rabbi, a philosophy professor, or a late-night conversation with a friend. That shift matters more than any single clever answer about the resurrection. When a teenager anywhere in the world, with no religious upbringing and no access to a seminary library, types "Who is Jesus?" into a chatbot at midnight, the answer they get back is shaped by a company's training choices as much as by the historical record. The all-faith research made that point in stark terms. Billions of people carry religious belief as a core part of how they process meaning, morality, and identity. And the systems increasingly mediating human knowledge were, at least as of that research, not built with that reality meaningfully in mind. There's also a deeper, more uncomfortable question sitting underneath all of this, one that the all-faith researchers themselves raised explicitly rather than leaving implied. IFA system can be measurably biased toward Catholicism in one context and measurably biased against agnosticism in another. Then the question stops being about what Grok thinks of Jesus specifically and becomes a question about what any of these systems are actually doing when they answer questions about meaning, morality, and belief at all. Are they discovering something close to an honest evaluation of the evidence, filtered imperfectly through statistical machinery? Or are they simply reflecting back an amplified, averaged version of whatever their training data happen to contain, dressed up in the confident, fluent tone that makes AI output feel more authoritative than it necessarily is? Researchers studying these systems don't have a clean answer to that yet, and anyone claiming certainty in either direction is overselling what's currently understood about how these models actually reason. What the Athens research did establish, concretely and repeatably, is that the bias exists and that it's measurable, which at minimum means no one should be treating a chatbot's answer about Jesus or about any contested question of ultimate meaning as a neutral final word. None of this means Grok's answers about Jesus were worthless or dishonest. In several documented cases, they were more careful than a lot of human commentary on the same subject, distinguishing historical fact from theological claim with a precision that talk shows and social media arguments almost never bother with. The manuscript evidence it cites is real. The historical consensus on Jesus' existence it repeats is accurate. The probability exercise it ran on the resurrection, however unusual it looks laid out in cold, percentages, was at least transparent about its own assumptions, which is more than most confident claims on either side of this debate ever offer. What Grok couldn't do, and what no AI system built on pattern recognition across existing text will ever be able to do, is tell you what it actually meant, if anything, for a group of frightened followers to claim they saw their executed teacher alive again, or what it would mean for you personally if that claim turned out to be true. A machine can lay out the manuscripts, run the probabilities, and summarize 2,000 years of argument in a few seconds. It cannot stand where those followers stood. That gap between processing information and living through meaning is exactly where the question of Jesus has always lived, long before anyone thought to ask a machine, and it's likely to stay there no matter how advanced these systems get. If this kind of story interests you, the collision between artificial intelligence and the oldest questions humanity has ever asked, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because this is only the beginning of that collision, not the end of it. Drop a comment with what you think a machine can and can't tell us about questions like this one, and share this video with someone who'd want to see both sides of this debate handled honestly instead of turned into a punchline. We'll keep tracking where this goes.